Welcome to the Dad Show podcast. How y'all doing?
It's part one today. Is that correct, Lincoln?
Yes,
Thank y'all for listening. Have a great day.
you too.
Welcome to the Dad Show Podcast, a show all about impacting, empowering, inspiring, and uplifting information to become a better dad, husband, man, and mentor. And now, your host, Ryan Ladd.
Welcome back to the Dad Show, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank y'all for being with us and being here. Today I got Mr. Jon Fogel. He's in a remote podcast with us today. He's not in studio. But Jon is the author of a book that's going to be out when this podcast airs. It's The Punishment-Free Parenting. And Jon is also the host of the WholeParent podcast. He's a social media influencer. And as if that isn't enough, he's a dad of four and a husband as well. So, Jon, I just want to thank you for being on the Dad Show and being with us today, man.
Ryan, it's my pleasure to be here. I love having conversations with other dads. And so, this is a treat for me.
Oh, it's going to be fun. It's going to be a treat for everybody else. And I'm going to learn a lot too. Jon's got some great tips on how to parent and be a better father. And just, man, I'm so excited about today. I really am. So, Jon, if you don't mind, before we get into everything I just said about you today, let's give people just a little bit of background. And then I want to kind of go into a little bit of childhood kind of stuff. And then we'll come up to present day.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I should start by saying that the first words in the book are, I was not always a punishment-free parent. And I know that just hearing that title, people want to kind of switch off and be like, oh, this isn't going to be worth my time. And so I would just encourage people, like, I am a pretty reasonable, normal person. And I have pretty reasonable, normal takes. I am not an extremist in any way. But I have learned a lot about parenting along the way. Not just from my own experience, but it's all framed around my own experience. So it started out as I was raised in a family, a Christian family, great parents, to be honest. There's very little that I can criticize about my parents, because when I look at what they came from versus how they raised me, there was a lot of generational baggage that they stripped off to do as good of a job raising me as they did. That said, I was raised in the 90s, and with that comes the fact that we just didn't know what we know now about the brain and about learning and about development. And a lot of people want to go back and they want to say, oh, well, things were easier back then, or things were simpler back then. That may be the case, but today, with the birth of the internet and with social media and with everything else, parenting is no longer as easy as it maybe once was. The things that we might have been able to get away with, and I'm not going to say any of us, there was consequences to all of that, but a lot of those consequences were far less severe than doing that same stuff today. And so when I had kids of my own, it was kind of three things happening all at once. First thing is that I had a kid earlier than anybody else in my social circle. So I got married to my high school sweetheart right out of college. We had a kid within 2 years of getting married.
Wow.
Which is a pretty standard, 1970s approach to child rearing and getting married and stuff. But this all happened, in the 2000s. And so very few of my friends, actually none of my friends, even to this day from high school, are married with kids. And so when we had our first son 8 years ago, there was nobody in my life who I could look to other than how I was raised, where I could say, this is how I should be raising my kid. And so I defaulted to that. Just, hey, we just do what was done to us.
Yeah.
And then at the same time that was happening, I was also in seminary to become a pastor. And I was also in foster care training, because we were going to foster to adopt. That was kind of our, what would have been laid on our heart, what we were kind of our mission going forward. And so simultaneously, we got this 1-year-old, maybe almost 2-year-old. Here I am in seminary. I had lost my dad at this time as well. He had passed away. And so I'm thinking about what it is to be a parent, what it is to be a dad. Now I'm a dad who doesn't have a dad anymore. And I had this really pivotal experience where I was learning all of this stuff about development and recognizing abuse and trauma in kids that's necessary to become a counselor, which is part of being a pastor, working in chaplaincy environments and things like that. And I'm watching all of these foster care training videos, which was how we were trained. And this woman who was the foster care trainer, she didn't have any educational background in development or psychology or anything like that, but she had just fostered like 25 kids, and that's how she had found this role with the state of Illinois.
Yeah.
And she said, after fostering these kids who came from kind of the most difficult behavioral baggage backgrounds. I mean, these kids were stealing stuff, tearing stuff up, cussing at their parents, like all of the things, right? Getting in fights, getting expelled. What she said was, really punishment doesn't work to teach anybody. And the only reason that punishment seems like it works is because there is a relationship of love and support in most families that can supersede the punishment.
Yeah.
But the punishment isn't what's teaching the lesson. The punishment actually is totally ineffective. But the relationship and the connection is teaching. And the punishment is just getting in the way. And with these kids who come from backgrounds where they don't have that connection, that relationship, the only way to teach them is with the relationship and punishment, or relationship and communication and love. And if you punish them, they'll actually just do the opposite. They'll just do all of the stuff that you are trying to punish them to get them to stop doing those things. They'll actually do those things more.
Wow.
And
I never thought of it that way, man.
It changed my life.
Yeah.
It changed my life. So here I am. I'm in seminary. I got this kid. I'm now I'm a licensed foster parent. And I just became consumed. And I have ADHD, so this is part of it. I hyperfixate.
Yeah.
And I became consumed with this idea that there must be a better way to parent, and that I had been lied to. And I'll come right out and say, part of the reason why I went to seminary in the first place is because I read the Bible for myself. And in that process, I realized that a lot of things that I thought were in there weren't in there, and a lot of things that I didn't never know about were there and prevalent. And so this was a very parallel experience of feeling like, boy, I really thought I knew how to parent. I'm very happy with the person that I've become. But I thought I knew how to parent, and in reality, a lot of the things that I thought I knew, it was the opposite.
Wow.
And so I consumed, I devoured like 25 parenting books in the span of, a month or two. And then I was not done with that. I was in an academic field, and so I had access to academic university libraries where I could go and just devour research papers and all this stuff. And I found out, oh, you know what? My sister-in-law's a neuroscientist. Didn't even really know what she did at work. Okay, now I'm going to find out.
Yeah.
And through that process, I basically came up with what was very clearly laid out in all of these books written by psychologists and developmental psychologists, stuff like that. And what was crazy to me was that what they were telling me on how I should parent was basically the opposite of what I assumed. And yet all of them agreed. Faith-based, non-faith-based, all of it.
That's what I was about to ask. So all this information that you consumed, was a lot of it conflicting, or it was just...
None of it was conflicting.
Wow.
And that was the only thing it conflicted with, was what I assumed I knew. And this basically propelled me to become a person who just, anytime I saw somebody struggling in my life with kids, now at this point I'd become a pastor, some time is passing as these things happen.
Yeah.
I'm watching children in my church struggle with things, and I'm counseling and I'm offering these solutions, and people are like, this stuff works, man. Like, this is crazy. And over time, I began to see changes in my own life with my own kids. And people just saying, like, I don't understand how your kids are so easy. And to me, I'm going, my kids aren't easy. That's crazy talk. But when you parent effectively, you don't have to repeat yourself. And you don't have to, fight over everything. You don't have to power struggle. You don't have to do this stuff that nobody wants to do in the first place. And so over time, I was just like, oh my gosh, this works so well. Then, I came across a little platform called TikTok. People might have heard of it before. It's in the news.
A little bit these days.
Little bit. We talk about it a little bit. And it was at that moment on TikTok when it was starting to become a platform for not just, a bunch of teenagers doing silly dances, but adults trying to share information. And I started sharing what I had learned, but just in a practical, actionable way, not in a real fancy, but I think people are smart. And I think, that's a weird take for people, but I think most people, if you explain things to them in a reasonable terms, they're going to get it. And man, almost overnight, within a couple months, I had a couple 100,000 followers. People just saying, I did this. And not just like I saw this video and I followed you. Like I saw a video, I thought, I wonder if that works. Then they went and tried it, and then they found me. They came back and found me because they were like, holy smokes, does this stuff work? And so it's nothing revolutionary.
Yeah.
It's just what people have known, what smarter people than me have learned from studies, from psychology, from neuroscans. We've known this stuff, but we have not yet gotten people to actually adopt this stuff. And so that's why I wrote the book. And that's why I became WholeParent. And that's why I started the podcast. That's why I did all of it, because I want to be a person who shares this information. So it's not news to people.
Yeah.
That you don't have to punish your kid, that actually it's getting in the way.
Well, that's, it goes against everything, just like you, the way that I was taught, the way that I was brought up. If I didn't clean my room when my dad told me to clean my room, he raised his voice, or I got a spanking, or, all the above. And so I find myself, even with my kid's condition, and I unfortunately, well, I'll probably give my daughter more grace because she's a big daddy's girl than I do my son. But even in this day and age, and I still get aggravated. I still raise my voice, and then obviously threaten with, if you don't do that, I'm gonna give you a spanking, or you're gonna be putting time out, or I'm taking whatever, some kind of punishment that way. So that's really powerful to hear that all this information and books, and from all these very, very smart people that are a lot smarter than I am, says the same thing, and it's not conflicting to the way that we were raised.
Well, and we also have to do some defining here, right? When I say punishment, I'm not saying that you don't ever hold your kids accountable. I'm not saying that you don't, that there is never a place for your kid to experience the consequences of their actions, or that you can't even impose certain consequences effectively that are non-punitive. What we're talking about with punishment is, in the most basic understanding of the word, is that we sometimes get into this mindset, and it works a little bit with adults, but actually what we're now learning is it doesn't even really work with adults. That if you cause a person some form of pain, and I'm not just saying physical pain like a spanking, but when you yell at a child, you're invoking fear, which is its own sort of social pain. You're invoking disconnection, right? Whenever you cause a person pain, their brain goes into a state, into a pattern of not learning anything. It's trying to survive. And the lie that we've told ourselves is that if you put a person into survival mode, that's so uncomfortable that they'll do anything that they can to not get in that place again. Where we've fallen short is realizing that just because they do things to avoid that does not mean that they've learned the lesson that we want them to learn.
Yeah.
It just means that they've learned a lesson. And so when people say, well, yeah, but I was spanked for doing, for talking back to my mom, and I never did that again. The many people say, well, so it worked. What you're saying is it worked. I would say, why didn't you talk back to your mother again? Did you not talk back because you knew that it hurt her feelings and that you're trying to be kind? Or did you not talk back because you were afraid? Did you not talk back because you arbitrarily learned that if you were going to say that stuff about your mom, you had to say it behind her back?
Not let anybody hear, yeah.
And not let anybody hear. And what we're actually conditioning children to do is not to stop any problematic behavior. We're conditioning them to hide their problematic behavior. And in the age of the internet, that is one of the most dangerous things that you can do. You have to be the person that your kid brings things to, because if you're not, you lose all semblance of leadership in your family.
So let's kind of put it into perspective. Let's say that, you do find your child talking back to your wife.
Yep.
And let's roll out that scenario so that we can kind of paint a picture of how you would handle that situation rather than, a spanking or,
Right.
Let's just hear it.
Any punishment, right?
Yeah.
So first and foremost, before we get into the practical, so I have this like 5-step thing in the book that goes through exactly what I would do in any scenario like this. And this is a perfect example, Ryan. So I'm glad that we're covering this one.
Okay.
But step 1, I call it whole because I'm WholeParent, WHOLE. So W is the wiring, understanding what's going on in your brain and their brain. And before we talk about how we can actually understand the wiring, what's going on with them in those moments, or your wife, you also have to appreciate that none of us parent from a blank slate. So Ryan, you could say, I never want to punish I read this book or I talked to this guy and I never want to punish my kids again. You're not starting from a blank slate. Just like when you start a journey to become work out or whatever, or quit any sort of, habit forming activity, you don't start from zero. And so the first step is always to ask yourself in those moments, and this is very uncomfortable for most men to ask themselves, where is this reaction coming from? And so when I walk up and see my kid talking back to my wife, is my reaction coming from, I am hurt that somebody would speak to my wife that way? Or is my reaction coming from, when I was growing up, if I ever did that, I was caused some serious discomfort or pain. And now when I see a child do that, the neural pathways in my brain fire. And I actually, and most people don't want to hear this, I get so anxious and nervous and scared, is the truth, that I will do anything to stop that behavior in that moment. And so when I see people who default to, what I call command demand parenting, just command demand, right? You stop that right now or else.
Yeah.
When I see people default to that, what I see is a person who's very scared of that emotional interaction. And we have to appreciate, because Ryan, I yell at my kids too sometimes. Like, I am not perfect in any way, shape, or form. I get to that point. I was never hit as a child, to be honest. And so that is never my default reaction. But I understand that people who were, that could have the same, feeling of, you kind of go into that automatic mode. So here's what the first thing you have to ask is, where is this actually coming from? Consider your own wiring. So the first thing I do when I walk into that situation is actually, I realize that any good parenting, if my child is talking back to my wife, one of two things is happening. One, they're so upset that they're saying things that they don't mean. Or two, they just have no clue what they're saying.
Yeah.
And if it's the second one, why are we treating them like they know what they're saying? I mean, it's like when that, your 3-year-old walks up and drops that pearl on you, drops that F-bomb on you. You don't know what's coming. Like, they don't know what they mean.
Yeah.
It's to respond to that the same way that you would a 15-year-old saying F you and slamming a door in your face. Come on. Let's be. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
I was just going to say, in that perspective, though, my mind goes to, I want them to know that they don't need to say those words, even though they know they're not saying what
Absolutely.
they are. But
And so,
teach them it's wrong.
No. And that's great teaching, right? Your goal is to teach them that saying these things is inappropriate in social scenario. And this is where I run afoul of a lot of the quote parenting experts on the internet who say that you should never say anything negative to your child or whatever, or that you should never tell them when they're doing something that's inappropriate. Your child, you are their first, you don't have to be their first bully to be their first teacher.
Yeah.
If my child comes up to me and says, Dad, what is mean? I don't have to get triggered, but I can say, well, that's something that you're probably not going to want to say around grandma.
Yeah.
You feel me? So number one, if figure out where it's coming from them. Once you've checked in with yourself and you're like, I'm calm, I can do this. If you're not calm, just walk away. And I'll tell you why that's in a second here, why that's okay to walk away. It's actually better to walk away. But if you're not calm, just walk away. But if you're calm and you check in and it's the second one, they have no clue what they're saying,
Yeah.
Then at this moment, we get curious. This is my second chapter of the book. It's called Get Curious, Not Furious. You get curious. You go, well, where'd you hear that? What do you think that means? And what's crazy is that the kids will tell you the funniest things. They'll be like, oh, that's when, this happens, or that's what dad says when blah, blah. And they will have no real conception of what they're saying. And that's a moment when you can teach. And that's beautiful. Yeah. And all of us had those people in our lives who sat us down and they taught us without having to make us feel bad about ourselves to do so. Yeah. So that's that second one. But if it's the first one, they are triggered and they are yelling and they are just saying the meanest things that pop into their head. In that moment, we want to grab control back. Here's the truth. No child can learn anything when they're like that. In the same way that no adult can. You see those people on road raging or whatever, you're not talking them down.
Yeah.
No adult can learn anything when they're in that brain state. No child can learn anything in that brain state. So here's the real thing. When you walk into those scenarios, and I know we're like hyperfixating on the first 3 seconds here. We're not even getting into what we say yet. But this is where most parents get stuck. What we think is,
thank you for watching part 1 and come back tomorrow for part 2. Thank you for listening to the Dad Show podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Dad Show podcast. Please like, review, and subscribe.